Good. So let's get started. I'm just starting up the presentation there. And I'm trying to find out if we're online. Good. So, and I'll share my screen. Who can share? All panelists. Okay.
Maybe I can already jump in and welcome everyone from the side of Project Access and the Access Academy to give you a short introduction to what the Access Academy is. The Access Academy is the final repository of knowledge of Project Access. We are focusing on three pillars. First of all, choosing your academic path. Secondly, applying to university. And thirdly, going to university. Our webinars are here to help you and motivate you to apply for study abroad. And especially this episode on Oxbridge interviews is to give you a chance to engage with Oxbridge students, learn more about their experiences from the interviews, and yeah, feel free to check out Project Access and the Access Academy if you haven't before. It's a great charity that connects people all around the globe, and I hope you have a great learning benefit from this webinar.
Okay, thank you so much, Marlene. Can everyone see the screen share now? Does that work? I hope it does. No?
Not yet.
Okay, because it shows us sharing on my thing. Share, good. One moment. Okay. One moment.
So maybe using the time where Alexander is preparing for the sharing his screen, we can just have a quick round of introduction of our panelists today. I'm very excited to welcome you all, and thank you for taking the time to share your experiences. So yeah, maybe you can just say one or two sentences of what you're studying, which college you're at, and what part you're playing at Project Access. So yeah, Juliet, do you want to start?
Yep. Great. Hi, everybody. I'm Juliet. I'm actually at Hartford College, Oxford. I'm studying PPE, and at Project Access, I'm the welfare officer, which essentially I'm responsible for safeguarding and kind of boring legal stuff. So, Julia, do you want to go?
Yep. So I'm Julia. I'm from Poland. I'm a second year ASNAC at Newnham. So I study Anglo-Saxon, Northern Celtic, which is a very niche course. You probably haven't heard about it. And at Project Access, I am the Cambridge campus officer since July this year. So I'm basically helping establish BA in Cambridge and recruit more mentors for NTs.
Hi, I'm Joseph. I'm studying law at Wadham College, Oxford. So I'm from Singapore, and I also serve as the PA Singapore's External Relations Officer.
So Juha?
Yes. I was wondering who was next. Well, hi, I'm Juha from Finland, and I'm a recently graduated historian from Wolfson College, Cambridge. So just around the corner from Julia. The college is right next to Newnham, and yeah, love history. And in Project Access, I'm the head of Finland, and yeah, so heading the operations of our Finnish team. Excited to be here tonight with you.
lovely to have you all. Yeah, I will give the word back to Alexander because we all can see the beautiful slides now.
Right, so yeah, thank you everyone for introducing yourselves. I prepared a few slides for that, but yeah, we'll just skip through them later, I guess. So yeah, also from my end, thank you very much everyone for joining and for putting in your expertise. This is now the official start of the framing, so to say. The interview workshop today or webinar is co-organized by Project Access International and especially the Project Access Academy. Malin has already explained what that is to you earlier, and Project Access Austria, and specifically in that case for our post-bootcamp program this year. So hello everyone to all the post-bootcampers who are today joining in a slightly differently formatted setting. I'll quickly walk through the agenda for today's call. There's going to be a skip of that and then a quick presentation of the basic facts about what interviews are, and then we'll hand over to the speakers to talk about their experiences. Right, so the agenda, what we'll do is first talk about the we already had the introduction of speakers, right? So that's we're going to skip a bit. And then we have the overview session, introduction, basic, what are interviews at Oxford and Cambridge. Then we'll have an experience session. That's why we have the speakers here to talk about their own interviews. We then have a Q&A session. You're going to be able to ask your questions in the Zoom call. I think there's a chat function or something. Maybe Alexia, you can look at that. And then we have the preparation tips. So that's sort of general tips. First of all, we're going to give some input on the slides again, then maybe personal tips from the speakers. And finally, a second Q&A sessions about the tips. So we already went through all of that. So let's talk about what interviews are. I'm going to go through that fairly quickly. For most people, it will be a repetition, but for those people who are joining you and who don't know anything at all about interviews, we want to give a bit of context and background in a structured way. First of all, who will be interviewed? Interviews in the UK, we're talking about the UK specifically and not about US interviews right now. Interviews are typical only for Oxford and Cambridge. Other universities don't typically interview applicants, and you'll be interviewed usually after you've submitted your online application. The deadline for that is typically the 15th of October. So for people who are applying this year, they have already submitted their online application. Someone raised their hand. Alexia, can you maybe look at if we can open up the text box or something for people to ask questions in chat function?
So the chat is already open, so people can just type in a question if they have one, and we can then read it out.
Super, thank you. And maybe we can give people like the opportunity to speak somewhere. I've never worked with this Zoom thing, so.
Yeah, I can just check it and then I just let you know if there's a question.
Super, thank you. Good, and yeah, once you've submitted your application, there's usually, depending on the specific course that you choose, something else to do. Maybe there's something to submit, writing sample, something like that, or you might have to do an admissions exam. That's before the interview, and then usually you'll get an invitation to an interview. It's different about how it differs between Oxford and Cambridge, how many people they interview. So for Cambridge, about 70–80% now that they actually invite an interview. For Oxford, it's a bit less than that. And typically, like for the majority of courses in Oxford and Cambridge, there will be an interview. So you will be required to interview for that. There are only very rare exceptions. Good. And then what's the interview itself? It's a bit difficult because it differs radically between courses and between universities and colleges. But in general, it's really just a conversation you have with some subject experts in the field that you're applying for. And the goal of the conversation is to get a good understanding of your subject-specific skills and your aptitude for studying it. And that's really about the potential for studying it. It's not only about what you already know, for example. And to evaluate your passion for the subject. You may be given different assignments or tasks, or just general interview questions. So it really depends on the specific course that you're applying for, the specific college that you're applying to, and the university. So there are different factors that change what we're going to talk about now, which is the format of the interview. So format will not be the same for everyone. It depends on the college, the subject, and the university. So for those people who've already applied to Oxford and Cambridge, you will know that typically you're going to apply to a course. So that's something like, say, history or law or PPE or human, social, and political sciences, things like that. So you're going to choose a course. And that's what I mean by subject here. Then you're going to choose a college. You don't need to do that in your application, but most people, or many people, do. And if you choose a college that you're applying to, then it's likely that this college will be the first college that's interviewing you. However, you might be interviewed by additional colleges if you end up in pooling. And if you don't give a preference in your application, then it depends on which college decides to interview you or to process your application in the end, where your interview is going to take place. And the university, by this I mean the difference between Oxford and Cambridge, right? And then it can also vary between years. That means it can be different compared to last year. So previous years are not always 100% reliable guide for what it's going to be like this year's year. And the interview will typically depend on the specific candidate. So maybe there's been something interesting in a personal statement. Maybe there's been something interesting in an essay you wrote or something. So it will be specific to you, the interview, and it will not normally be the same questions for every candidate. And in terms of length, it also varies widely. Typically, it will be between 20 and 45 minutes, but there can be shorter interviews, there can be longer interviews than that. And really, it always depends, again, on your college subject and university. And in terms of how it works, in previous years, usually you'd travel there in person for people who can, or you'd take it online. There's no discrimination of people who cannot travel there. And this year, I would expect for most people to have the interviews online. In Oxford, it's typically several days of interviews. So you would travel there, you'd get free accommodation and board and food, and be interviewed for several days. That means that you'd have maybe an interview one day, another interview another day. It doesn't mean that you have several days of interviews throughout, of course. And then in Cambridge, usually it's only on one day, and you might have many interviews that day. But in both places, it can be the case that you have several interviews on a day, or several interviews by different colleges, if several colleges are interested in your application, or if you get pooled. Right. Possible tasks that you could be prompted with for the interview include, for STEM subject, problem sets, statistics and graphs to interpret, proof questions. For humanities, you might be required to read a passage in advance of the interview. You might be required to read a short passage during the interview. And that passage will typically be a subject-specific text. And you're then going to be asked questions about that. It might also include, again, statistics and graphs to interpret, or you just go in there and in a traditional interview style will be asked questions to answer. Then, yes, what do interviews test you for? Well, one important thing to bear in mind there is that there isn't one type of ideal Oxbridge students, so they don't want you to conform to a specific type. Mostly what they're looking for is high academic potential. Oxford and Cambridge are universities that are very sort of academically oriented, maybe in contrast to some American universities. Which are more about sort of well-rounded personality. The Oxbridge interview will be very subject specific, and the people there, the people interviewing you who are tutors, really looking for people that would make good students in their course. So that doesn't mean that you have to know everything about a subject already. That's not the purpose of going to study at university. And people who are interviewing you will be aware that people might have different levels of knowledge from their background, from university, from the schools they go to, and that's not the difference that they're looking for. What they're looking for is the potential for you to be a good student, and that's really mainly having on the one side a passion for the subject and a strong interest, and on the other hand certain sort of general skills that will enable you to do well in the degree. It doesn't mean that you have to know everything, to repeat myself. Some sample questions. Let's look something at what Project Access Singapore found there. So you might be asked in a law interview a question about a plane that's being hijacked on a flight. Obviously that's an international flight, so then which country is responsible there? You might be you might be asked a question in physics about velocity in this case, or you might be asked a question in PPE about sort of moral. That's a typical moral philosophy question. Also about policy, about the moral responsibility for the climate in case of air travel, and the pollution that's generated by air travel. So that could be typical questions, and they could be completely different again. But that's something to look at. It has something to do with your subject, and it looks at your ability to reason independently. Who will be interviewing you? Typically, it will be people who work at the university, most generally, and who work in the subject or teach the subject that you're applying for. In most cases, it will be people from the college or that are members of the college, that's fellows of the college that you're interviewing for. However, many colleges don't have especially smaller colleges don't necessarily have fellows for every subject, so they might recruit someone else to do the interviews for them from the university department. And yes, that's something to bear in mind, is especially at Cambridge, there are many interview exams, so that will be exams that you're doing the same day or at the time of, or around the time when you're doing the interviews as well. So that's an exam that's also in addition to the interview part of your application. Right, so how do you know if you're invited to the interview? Usually you'll get an email. Something to bear in mind there is that some of them will be quite last minute, but most of them try to be 2 weeks in advance, which is also quite last minute, but it can be worse than that. And so do check your emails and do not assume that you're not invited, and do keep preparing until the last minute for the interview. Good. So now we can, after a very quick sort of run through the basics, hand over to the speakers, and I would just walk through like maybe one by one through their experience, and maybe someone wants to volunteer, otherwise I'll decide for someone to start.
I can start if that's okay. Starting off with with humanities, unless anyone else is rushing. I just want to ask, what was the kind of how long a monologue should I have, or how much should I aim to speak in order for others to have time as well?
So we planned a total of 20 minutes for the
Yeah, right,
so that's
great.
5 minutes per person.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think the questions that Alexander just raised a few slides ago were very, very interesting in a sense that they're very kind of fascinating problems, and it's easy for you to imagine yourself thinking about them in a conversation with a professor. But what was really interesting about my interview experience was that all questions that I got were directly derived from my personal statement and the essays that I sent in to the university. So at no stage did I have a kind of an interview question which was just sort of thrown at me, and it's really kind of a it's also very much a kind of an Oxbridge trope, a stereotype that you just get thrown a question that is a trick question or a very difficult kind of a brain teaser question, and it might happen, but my experience was just not really like that. I want to tell that there's really a lot of all kinds of urban legends that also circulate in Cambridge about interview questions. I just have to tell one of them very quickly. In a STEM question, a candidate was asked to evaluate the consistency of or sort of the contents of a card deck, playing card deck, and then he kind of started to think about these elaborate chemical formulas of cellulose, etc. And apparently the interviewer was just like, no, you can just look at the box; it says what it's made of. So this is a legend. So my point, there was a point to this joke, was also that if you get a question like that, or a question that kind of feels like that, you probably will not get a question which is kind of as directly ridiculous as that. Do not overthink. Take your time to think about the question. It is always much better to have an awkward silence of perhaps a minute to think about the question, and then come back with a structured answer. But you can expect to have questions that will be probably very much related to your personal statement, really not out of the blue. As I did. So it also really emphasized the importance of knowing your personal statement and your essays really well. You don't need to know them by heart, but you kind of need to know what you meant when you said them. When you said there are certain things in those essays, in those personal statements, what you were thinking, what was your intent, and what might be possible counter arguments or sort of weak points in that. So know those things also very well. Piece of advice that I might give at this stage is that if you get a very difficult question, some candidates tend to panic in a sense that they imagine a very elaborate answer to this question that they get, or they think that they they need to provide an answer that is very elaborate and impressive. And under pressure, the distance between your head, which is sort of blank, and that answer can be quite daunting. So my advice to handle the stress in this situation is not really to think about reaching an answer, but just starting to think. And if you just come up with something with more or less interesting things to say about how you would think about the problem, that's already great. So just to sum up, don't worry about the questions. They're probably going to be quite conventional, and take your time to think. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juha. Maybe Julia, do you want to continue?
Yep. So I think the most important thing to stress about interviews is they differ so much for each of the subjects. So as Juha said, he was asked about the personal statement and his essays in detail. It was entirely different for me. I sent in 2 essays and I wasn't asked anything about them. The questions I got were referring to my personal statement more indirectly. Yeah, so for example, when I mentioned the sort of comparative thinking between languages in my personal statement, I wasn't asked about one of the languages I mentioned and one of the languages I would like to study in my course. And the question itself wasn't difficult, but it was a bit tricky. Although the interviewer had to remind me that she wasn't trying to trip me up. So this is the most important thing. They want to see you succeed, really, in the interview. They don't want to ask you something that will just completely stop you from talking. So my experience was that I had 2 interviews, and for my subject, it tends to be that one interview is focused on the subject itself, and then the other one is quite general. So it's usually conducted by someone from outside of the department. But for me, it was basically two subject interviews. So in the first one, I was interviewed by my by the tutor, by the professor who is currently my lecturer and my director of studies. So since I have supervisions with her, it's really good to see, and it's quite reassuring that the interview itself is very similar to a supervision, so the mode of teaching that you will get. So your performance is for both sides to see if you can work well in the circumstances. So if this particular mode of teaching is working for you. Then for sort of specific bits of my interview. So for example, I got a bit of text to analyze, so I asked a historical source. So they wanted to see the sort of analytical skills. So I was supposed to read a bit and say what the particular bit of a chronicle tells me. Then in the second interview, for example, I got a picture of I think it was a coin or something else, and sort of what kind of questions I would like to ask the objects, what I like to learn from it. And all of these things are kind of the evidence that we work with in the degree. So every bit of the interview is aimed to sort of make you show the lecturers, the interviewers, the way you think, and if you can really get the most out of the course if you're successful in your interview. Yeah, that would basically be it for me.
Thank you so much. Maybe Joseph, do you want to contribute your story?
Sure. So I interviewed with Oxford for law about 2 years ago. So unlike Juha, I also didn't get asked anything about my personal statement. So I think from my experience, I understand that different colleges and different universities can range entirely from referencing to your personal statement directly, indirectly, or not at all. So for the 2 interviews that I got, the first interview was essentially a hypothetical interview where the interviewers, who are my tutors now, gave me a scenario, and then based on this scenario, asked me several follow-up questions before asking me to craft a rule. So the scenario is something like this. So if A wants to set up an antique shop, but he needs £10,000 to set it up, and B, being his friend, knows that he needs that £10,000 and is willing to lend him that £10,000, but he's only willing to do so if he knows that A knows something about antiques. But A tells him, I did a university course on antiques, but A lied, and B gives him the money. Should A be obligated to return the money? So we had a discussion about this hypothetical scenario. And then based on whether I said he should or should not be obligated to do so, then my tutors asked me to craft a rule. So I was given pen and paper and then to write it down, and then we further discussed the rule to refine it along the way. So that was my first interview. My second interview was sort of a flip of that. So in this case, my second interview, I was given a rule itself. So it was a statute, a line from the barrister's code. And then based on the rule, I was given several hypothetical scenarios and asked whether I think the rule would apply in that case or in that case. And the whole point of hypotheticals is really to assess your ability to identify minor and narrow nuances between different scenarios, and also your ability to apply the context you are provided in scenarios. So this is very specific to law, but could also be relevant to certain other humanities subjects as well. So just have a little bit of time just to give a little bit of insight on the other side of the coin. So for STEM subjects, I think the scariest Cambridge natural sciences interview I heard is a friend who went into an interview and was handed a candle, so like a physical candle, and asked by her interviewers, if we were to burn this entire candle in this room, estimate the volume of gas released, and you just have to go at it. So really, I think a few tips I would give is, as Julia very rightly pointed out, the interviewers are not there to trip you up. They want to help you succeed. And if you need to clarify anything, please feel free to ask clarifying questions. It's always better to ask a question than to make a wrong assumption and then go down an entirely wrong route. Secondly, think out loud. So this may be a little bit unnatural to some of you who are very cautious about, okay, I want to say the right things and only the right things. But then the thing about the tutorial and supervision system is that it's about open discourse, and being able to think out loud and talking your interviewer through your thought process is very helpful in doing that, because not only does it demonstrate to your interviewer your own thought process, it also allows them to identify specifically where you may have gone wrong in your thought process, such that they can ask you prompting questions to help guide you through rethinking where you have gone wrong, for instance. So in summary, remember to think out loud, ask clarifying questions if need be, and always try your best to engage with the questions. Yeah. So I think it's Juliet.
Hey, it's Julie again. I would say, I mean, I cannot agree with what Joseph said more regarding the pointing out the little nuances in the questions. I interviewed at Oxford twice. Well, I was a reapplicant the first time. I applied for PPE, I got rejected, so I applied again. And I can say that it differs, the interview process differs tremendously between colleges. For my first set of interviews, I had both times I was set some sort of problem sheet / questions before the interview, given some text to read and mark up and answer a few questions on. And I think the biggest thing is obviously just to kind of examine the nuances within the questions, because even for the STEM questions, I got a bunch of maths questions at interview that I was not expecting. The maths questions kind of relied on a bunch of different assumptions that we were making about the world. And when you're actually dig down and investigate those assumptions, that's what the tutors like to see about, like that's what they like to see in the interview, because it's also what's reflected in the supervision. As far as like the left field out of the blue questions, there were a few of those. I can't say that they used our personal statement directly or indirectly. They kind of glanced at it once during one of my 3 interviews, but never really asked me anything about it directly, besides the fact, what makes you get out of bed in the morning? So just a general question. I would say the most important thing is just to kind of chill your nerves and get over the awkward silence that can be a problem on Zoom, because even in a lot of our tutorials and even talking to a screen, it's difficult, but accepting the fact that you might have an awkward silence for a minute or two whilst you think about a question is just completely okay. And try not to act like it's too stilted either. It's totally okay to say the wrong thing, because at least you kind of recognize that you're what you think about the subject is not the final word on it. So it's about that back and forth. It's about being open to new ideas and not being afraid of the awkward silence. That's about it.
Cool, thank you very much. So now we're ready for questions about the experiences of people, but also if you have any questions about maybe what to expect, how it felt like being interviewed. Everyone is free to ask questions now. I think we had a question earlier, and I'm not sure we answered it in the right channel regarding whether the personal statements. Are we allowed to have our personal statements? There was a question about that in the chat. And anyone else who wants to ask a question, please just raise your hand or type the question in the chat session. And if you raise your hand, I will sort of allow you to talk, as Zoom says, and you're then going to be able to say something that. So feel free. By the way, to raise your hand, you click on participants down there, and then you can click on the stop dot thing, and then you can raise your hand there, I think. Or in the Q&A session. So there is a question we have for Juliet. How did you prepare for your interviews?
That is a tough one. Is this for me? I guess.
Yes.
Okay. The first thing is just kind of, I'd say for the STEM subjects, just kind of going over some maths like before the interview or a couple of days before even just helps immensely. I don't know if you have like whatever either practice problems, that's what I used, or like problems from whatever like advanced math, like maths or science problems that you found particularly interesting in your classes or particularly difficult. Those are kind of problems that you might see again in the interview, like the one that Malin put on the slides about the rocket and velocity. So just kind of pointing out those more niche problems, and then also looking, they're not expecting you to know every formula in the book. That's totally not what the interview is about. It's more just about making sure that you can draw connections between different formulas and understanding where one piece of knowledge, let's say this parabolic trajectory, where that comes from mathematically, and asking you to prove it. So doing that, and then obviously just kind of, I don't know, I think there were some recommendations about brushing up on online courses or watching philosophy YouTube videos or whatever it might be, to kind of broaden your perspective and look at things that you wouldn't otherwise look at.
Cool. Thank you very much. We have another question that's anonymous. Yeah, you can also use the Q&A session there. What kinds of questions can we expect in different PPE interviews? Okay, so that's relevant for someone who did something PPE relating. We can try to answer that later on as well if you want.
Yeah, I'll give the other people a bit more space, and I'll come back to the PPE one, I promise.
Okay, good. Okay, which colleges have you applied for? That's good for each one, each speaker.
All right, so I'll start. So when choosing my college, I did a bit of research. So it's not necessary, it really depends on the person, but there are some criteria I looked at for choosing my college. So I did choose my college and apply to only this one. So that's UNAM College. So I had my interviews at UNAM, both of them. But it's not really necessary to choose your college. So again, it depends on what you're looking for. If you want a big college, a small one, grants, or the kind of accommodation you can get. So it's quite a personal thing. And I'd say don't look at sort of feuds between colleges and prestige and things like that. It's really secondary at best.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm attending Wadham College now, but I previously actually applied to Trinity in Oxford, and I applied to St. Cat's in Cambridge. So I actually applied to both Oxford and Cambridge. So to echo something Julia specified, yes, it's very important when you choose your college, right? Don't be obsessed about like prestige. Oh, I need to go Trinity Cambridge because Trinity Cambridge is like the best, or like St. John's in Oxford or something. Because there are a lot of practical differences that people don't really realize when choosing their colleges that actually do make a difference. So for example, not all Cambridge and Oxford colleges offer 3 years accommodation on campus. So for instance, Wadham College previously required second years to move out. And this can be a very big problem if, for instance, you're an international student. Other practical things you might want to take note of is financing and scholarships. So for instance, if you qualify for the Jardine scholarships, there are only 4 colleges in both Oxford and Cambridge that will allow you to apply for the Jardine scholarship. So do keep a lookout on these things. And I guess more practically think about things like, okay, you're going to be living here for 3 years. So how's the accommodation? How's the food? How's the support and the culture of the college? These are certain things that you might want to be thinking about. Yeah, that's all from me.
Cool.
Yeah, for myself, I can. I think, was anyone else pooled? But I was pooled. Yeah. Of course. As you said. Yeah. So you applied to Trinity Oxford. Yes, I applied to Trinity Cambridge and was pulled from Trinity Cambridge to Wolfson, which is a mature college. I was a bit older, and yeah, it was a really good experience for me. Perhaps being with people of my age. I was 21 when I started, and 21 is the kind of the age limit from which mature colleges accept people. But yes, I think I agree with the main theses of the previous respondents. So that, you know, if in any way possible, do some research, and if you're the kind of person who feels like they want to have more control over their application, I would recommend choosing a college after some research. But kind of you know, on the other side of the coin, I could say that, you know, don't obsess over the college, and don't get upset if you're pooled. So yeah.
To that, I would say, because I was pulled on my first application, I applied to Brasenose, and the second application I applied directly to Hartford, and I got interviewed at Hartford, and now I'm here. So I would say, yeah, don't get upset if you're pooled, especially if you apply to one of the oversubscribed colleges. Oxford published admissions data for pretty much all the subjects and how many people apply to each college for each subject, and then how many places there are at each college for each subject. So you can get a very good idea of which colleges attract the most applications for particular subjects. And I mean, by all means apply to those colleges, but don't be surprised if you get pulled. And yes, accommodation and food can make a huge difference, especially to international students. Although keep in mind, some colleges, like more students live in, like at Hartford, most students choose to stay in all 3 years. And then at other colleges, most students are expected to leave after second year and go find accommodation elsewhere. And food, just kind of look at like, or even COVID arrangements, for example. Our college has a marquee. It's like an outdoor tent with a bar in it and whatnot. And but just kind of looking at all the different things that you might want to get involved in at college is really important as well.
Cool. So thank you, everyone. We have a number of questions now, and I'll just sort of summarize them so we sort of get through them more quickly. And then all the speakers, panelists, you're also free to answer the questions either in the Q&A sections or in the chat directly in writing, if that's easier or quicker. So I'll just go through them here. how can you tell if you're doing well during an interview? So do you have any sort of feedback? Is there anything that you should be looking out for during the interview? Then maybe that's a general question. I mean, this one is phrased for PPE specifically, but how do you gain background knowledge, or how relevant do you think background knowledge in the subject specific area is? And how do you sort of build up? And we're still going to go through the tip section. So I'm going to talk about that a bit more, but maybe from your own experience, what worked well there. And then there's a question. I'm currently starting at uni in my home country. And university seems to be is well known in the home country. Will that affect my chances at Cambridge? I.e., will I not be admitted since they think I might not accept the offer? So if someone is already studying somewhere, but then applying sort of, I think it would be interesting to have some background information there if that's a second application, if you're applying for a master's degree maybe. So maybe Harshit, if you could give some more information there, but let's try to go through those questions and then we'll do a final round. So still feel free to ask questions in the section and raise your hands if you want to ask questions directly. And then we'll move on to talking about tips for preparation. Good.
Julia, I think now might be a good chance to do the PPE questions.
Okay, fine. I'll do the PPE questions. I would say there are a couple of kind of key elements that you should expect to kind of come up again and again in philosophy, politics, and economics. And essentially, it's a bit of the quote unquote first year PPE syllabus. These topics just, they love them. You'll see them kind of mainly from what comes up in the Financial Times or the Economist, major economics newspapers, but just generally, I'd say thorny political issues. For example, my first interview, I got asked about the ethics of selling citizenship. You might get asked a question about posthumous harm, like if our body doesn't exist, how can we be harmed? Weird, I guess, just really weird philosophical questions. And in a way, I'd say, do your reading around the subject, but that's not going to get you an answer to all of these weird questions. I'd say let's say take one of these questions like posthumous harm and say, if our body doesn't exist, how can we be harmed? And then try to break down the question into, well, what exactly does harm mean? What exactly does our body mean? What exactly does existence entail? So breaking down the question into its constituent parts and doing what Oxford students call defining your terms, which essentially means, what do all these words mean? Is a very, very good way to kind of start thinking about these PPE interview questions and preparing yourself for the way PPEists think. I hope that answers your question, because as far as areas on background knowledge, there's a lot to say about that. There are probably a few things that I would really emphasize is free will, utilitarianism, and the Financial Times. If you want to quote me on the 30 things that will probably come up in your PPE interview, it will be those 3. I don't know why they love them, but they're usually what comes up in first week of the very first thing you do when you get here. So that's it.
Okay, thank you very much. There was one more question also regarding how do you know if you've done well? And maybe you also want to go into that. Joseph, sorry for...
Yeah, I think Yuha wants to say something. Yeah, I saw your hand. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. Damn it! A classic Zoom episode. Yeah, I just wanted to quickly kind of say that I would argue that it might not be the best thing to actually think about during the interview, whether you're doing well or not. Just sort of, I mean, yeah, it sounds very cliche and kind of and just fuzzy, but toning down on this kind of self-awareness might be beneficial for you, you know, when it comes to the outcome. Sort of just being self-aware, of course, in a sense that, you know, you think about what you say and you structure your answers, but please just, you're going to think about the interview for weeks and weeks. Like, I obsessed about my interview, well, until I got my offer. So you just sort of save yourself a little bit and try not to think about the interview during the interview. This will, if you're, I don't know, maybe I'm going to throw in some kitchen psychology, but for example, some sort of mindfulness exercises might be beneficial. Just coming to the interview well prepared in the sense of, you know, having eaten well, having slept well, etc. Trying to have a regular sleeping schedule before the interview, for preferably for several weeks, is just going to put you in a better state of mind that you wouldn't be really anxious about it, you know, during the process. So I don't know whether what do others think about this, but yeah, of course, I do think that it's possible to think about how you're doing, but this is my advice.
Yeah, I agree entirely. Basically, I think don't think about it at all, because for purposes of like fairness also, I think the tutors try not to give away signs that people are doing well or not well. Like some of your tutors may encourage you to go in certain directions, but I remember in my own interviews, the interviewers are all very deadpan about it. Yeah. And yeah, if you worry too much about it, you are distracting yourself from actually answering the question, which just shoots yourself in the foot. Yeah.
I would stress one thing. It's really hard to, even after the interview, it's really very, very uncertain whether you feel good after the interview or you're about to cry. There's really no rule. Some people who left their interviews in, you know, a bad state of mind, feeling they failed, and they still got in. And yeah, it can be exactly the opposite. You can feel that you did really, really well, and then it turns out you didn't. So it's really best not to think too much about it. In the end, it is what it is, and I think you have really broke it down quite well. So I think it's really best to focus on the basics, to really be in a sort of calm state of mind when you come, and not to overthink things. And you might feel that the interview is very awkward and you're not doing well, and it's fine to feel it, but you might be wrong, and it's perfectly fine. And it's in the end up to the interviewers to decide. And yeah, do not stress too much about it.
I'd say also an important thing to add there is just to be flexible. The tutors want you to have a good interview as well. So if you're kind of veering off in the wrong direction and they see that, you know, you have a good idea, but you're just taking this the wrong way, they're going to try to get you like back on like their track to have just a good interview. So just kind of follow the tutor's cues, I guess, and that should be a good sign as to whether you're doing well or not.
And in a sense, one more thing that I would add to what I said is that if you feel that you've struggled, I think that might actually be a good sign, because the interviews are there to also to kind of, well, paradoxically both be nice and comfortable discussions of your subject, but also to really push you intellectually. And if you feel that you really, you know, exercised your mind and that you kind of struggled with it a little bit, I would see it as a very good sign, really, that it means that the discussion sort of progressed relatively long down your kind of in exploring your intellectual abilities.
Okay, cool. So we have 2 more questions and one more that came in. So one is about how do you react if you feel like you're blocked in that situation? You sort of have a blackout, or how do you call it? Not blackout. Like when you don't know what to say, like you don't know how to continue. In an interview, is there a strategy you feel? One is for the skills that you're looking for. So are there specific questions, specific skills they're looking for that you can sort of talk about in that generality? And there was one more, what was it? Now shows it as answered. At what time are the interviews? I'm not sure if by time is meant time in the day or time of the year. It's not answered with time in the day, but maybe you can talk about what time in the year it was. And then we'll move on to the next section.
I would just reply to the easiest question. They're usually at the beginning of December. So, and then very rarely you might have additional winter pool interviews, but they happen. They're not really a common occurrence. So if a college pulls you in January, you might be re-interviewed by another college, but usually your application would be picked from the pool without an interview, just based on your initial file.
Okay, so who wants to volunteer for sort of being blocked in your interview, don't knowing how to continue, sort of any strategies there? Have you had the experience yourself? And there's one more question that came in regarding aptitude tests. How important are they? Maybe in your experience, did you have to do well for the aptitude tests, or how does it combine with the interview?
If no one wants to take the being stumped question, I can do that. So it happened to me in both my Oxford interviews. So right at the end of both my interviews, I was asked a particularly hard question that I couldn't really answer. So I think if you're looking for strategies on how to deal with this, firstly, if you have water with you, that's great, because you can just take a sip of water to buy yourself some time to think. And also, I think some people have mentioned that it's fine to have an awkward silence for a while. It's even better if you just ask the interviewer, do you mind if I take a minute to think about this? They will 100% say yes. So use these strategies to buy yourself time to think, and also think out loud. So this is basically something which I said earlier, right? So in my second interview, when I didn't know how to answer the question that was being posed to me, I sort of started thinking around the issue. So I started thinking, okay, how can we approach the matter which is being posed? Okay, so this is the premise. Are there any assumptions being made? What do I think is relevant to this? So even though I'm not directly answering the question because I didn't know how to answer the question, I could at least demonstrate how I was approaching the problem. And then that was the basis upon which the tutors would help to guide you on. So the reality is that for the first interview, fortunately, I managed to think of an answer and respond at the end of the day. But my second one, I just could not think of an answer. And so the interview just awkwardly ended on me not being able to answer the question. But I think that also goes to show that don't worry too much about whether you did well or didn't do well, because you can never tell. And oftentimes, if you're being asked difficult questions, it might be a good sign because your tutor is there trying to push you to see how far you can perform. Yeah, so don't worry about it too much.
Okay, cool. So if there are any more questions, I think we can keep them for the next Q&A session. I think it overlaps.
I think, sorry, I might just add, I think we didn't address Harsith's question about applying after having started at university. I just wanted to just briefly say that, Arsid, I think you're going to be fine, and everyone else in the same situation. I knew people who did a year or two in either another British university or a university abroad and applied and got in. So you might mention it in your application that you're at this university, and that it might even be an asset for the application in a sense that if you get in, you will have had a year of university experience already, and that might put you in good stead. So it shouldn't be an issue. There's a track record of people taking that route.
Cool. Thank you. Am I unmuted now? Oh, no. Yeah. As I mentioned, there's going to be another Q&A session later on, sort of specifically for preparation tips. I think some of that has been covered now, so just feel free, if any more questions to come up in the meantime, to just post them in the Q&A session or in the chat, and we're going to collect them again later on. So I'll just go through general preparation tips, and maybe, also for orientation, the session is planned for until 8:30, because there were some questions. General tips, I think there are three big things you can think about. First of all, planning your preparation. Second, anticipating what's going to happen. And third, practicing. And I think the third thing, practicing, is really the core activity there to do and to focus on. Is not only about reading a lot and passively absorbing a lot of information, but it's really about trying to engage actively with the material and with subject-specific material, and trying to speak about it, most importantly, because in the interview you're going to have to talk about that in a sort of person-to-person setting, and practicing that specific setting is going to be really, really important. So let's go through that. Planning. In terms of planning, we generally recommend making a timeline until the interview. So you should ideally have prepared a bit already, but no worries. Try to really structure every day until the interview is going to be happening, from now on at least, and try to plan something, some activity for every day. In terms of anticipating, try to think about possible questions yourself, come up with questions yourself that you could be talking about. And try to research the specific interview format for that college and that subject, and especially also for different colleges, as you might be interviewed by more than one college, so you can expect what's going to happen. And then practice. And for practicing, it's a good opportunity to ask other Project Access mentees to work with. So in Project Access Austria, for example, we have groups of mentees studying similar subjects from your supervision groups, and feel free to ask people from your supervision groups to prepare for the interviews and prepare each other. That's also a good way to come up with possible interview questions, is come up with possible interview questions to ask each other in mock interviews. If you get the chance, try to use online tools and online platforms to find additional interview trainers, and of course you can ask your Project Access mentor. In terms of building up subject-specific knowledge, we've already talked about reading as subject-specific literature. I think one thing to keep in mind there is being selective about the literature you read. Don't just read anything sort of roughly to do with the topic, but try to go into scientific texts. That's sort of university level texts already, to prepare you for the sorts of arguments and the sorts of reasoning that you're going to be confronted with at university level. After all, in the interview, your tutors want to find out if you'd be a good student there. So picking up some of that subject-specific language can be quite useful as well. Introductory textbooks can be useful. Open online courses can be useful. And again there, don't just read or sort of passively engage with the subject, but also try to be active. If you can talk about it with someone, then writing essays is a good way of sort of structuring your reasoning, especially for humanities students, of course. or for STEM subjects, maybe work through problem sets, actually do the thinking instead of just sort of receiving information. And that can be much more time effective as well in terms of preparation. For personal questions, it's also a good idea to be prepared. We've already talked about the personal statement, so make sure you bring it and to read through about it and think about what questions you could be asked about your personal statement. Then think about why Oxbridge, why so Oxford or Cambridge, so why the specific university, you decide for one of them. Then think about why you've applied for that specific course, what are your personal reasons. Try to know the course in detail, try to think about what does the course cover, research that, you might be asked questions about that. What are your personal qualities for succeeding in that course, and also questions about sort of generally disagreement, conflict. They're getting more important these days. Good, and then anticipating the interview format, concrete steps you can take there, sending emails to your college to ask them if they don't provide you with information in advance. So it's completely fine. Colleges are used to dealing with email inquiries from prospective students, so don't be hesitant to send emails to the college or to the university if there's anything unclear. Inside Uni is a really, really good platform that records how interviews work for specific subjects at specific colleges. So that's really, really good. Make sure to check that out. And then study the interview section on the university website. So there's a general university website usually where interviews are outlined, and then there are sample questions, and here are only some sources for those. And there are many, many other sources that you can consult online. And bringing to your interview your personal statement, stationery. You might be allowed to use a calculator. There was a question about that earlier in the Q&A. You can, in some cases, bring a calculator, but that really depends on your course and maybe on the college as well. And there might only be specific types of calculators or specific models that might be permitted. So don't just bring any calculator and assume it's going to be fine, but make sure you get the calculator that's allowed and permitted to be used, if there's one to be allowed to be used. Blank paper, maybe a pen as well. A water bottle is a good idea to keep you hydrated. In addition to that, I would recommend generally for exams and stuff to bring some sugar. It's usually after your brain is drained for a few hours thinking, it's good to have some sugar, so sweets or something to get you working again. And then administrative documents. You might be required to bring some of them, like invitation, whatever. What to wear, there's also been a question about that, but might be relevant for everyone again. There's no need to wear a suit, absolutely not. Most tutors will be dressed informally as well. And you can wear whatever you like wearing, so you just have to be comfortable. And I think that's really important to stress, that you shouldn't be wearing anything because you expect it to be required. And the other students that come will wear all kinds of different things as well. So really the most important thing is it has to be something you're comfortable in and something that gives you confidence. Good, so we do the final Q&A session now. Just ending the screen share there. If you have any final questions specifically about preparing, about concrete steps you should take, then feel free to ask them now, and I'll try to summarize them again or raise them directly to the speaker. So the first one we have is, should I expect questions about the letter of reference to further explain things my teacher has talked about?
I wouldn't say so, because normally you're not expected to actually know what is inside a letter of reference, because you don't get to see it normally. So you might be able to agree with your teacher what you'd like the letter to contain, but you shouldn't actually know what's inside, so you can be asked about it. It's there to support your application, so the admissions people can see yet another angle, can see a little bit more about you as an applicant. So yeah, you shouldn't be asked about it.
Okay. Good. Unless there are any more questions coming in, there's one coming in. How can I deal with rejection? So maybe that's a general question. How did you get feedback on whether you were accepted or not? Like when did that come? And then in terms of rejection, how would you deal with that? Maybe rejection also from specific colleges. And then to what extent should I be able to recall the content of books I've mentioned in my personal statement?
Yeah, I can take that. So generally speaking, if you're going to be writing about a book in your personal statement, you should know enough about it to discuss it. So not only should you know what is inside the book, but you should have an opinion about what is written inside the book as well. The thing is that this also differs based on your interview. So usually you won't be asked about the books you write in your personal statement unless you have gotten a personal statement driven interview, which I think based on the experiences that the four of us have shared, it's actually not that common. Yeah, so do be prepared, but you may not necessarily be asked on it. Yeah, and I think to take the how can I deal with rejection question. Yeah, so well, that's a big question. Yeah, the thing is that I got rejected from Cambridge when I applied in 2017. I think the reality is just that if it happens, it happens. Like you should learn from your experience, and then if you have the opportunity to reapply, do that. If not, there are always other doors that open. So for Cambridge and Oxford, their feedback policy differs college to college. Some colleges require you to actually email them to ask for feedback. But when I got rejected from Cambridge in 2017, they sent a letter to my teacher referee who forwarded to me with feedback on my performance. Yeah, so that was how I learned from it. Yeah. Anyone else wants to share how to deal with rejection?
Well, when it comes to college, that's not a big deal, really. If you get pulled, you get pulled. We've discussed this already. So really, really.
Yeah, I think he just.
Is it only,
You're done. That's the big thing.
You're a bit cut off there. Can you maybe? Your internet connection seems to be a bit bad. Maybe you can try turning off your video for a moment. Maybe then it works better.
It's the same university, so people very, very often underscore the differences between the colleges, but it's like actually the same university. So I mean, of course, it's true that so people very, very often like resident halls and places like kind of the same institution. So that that's kind of.
It doesn't really seem to work, Johan. Maybe it's better now.
Am I back? I guess I was lost for a sec.
Yeah, no, for more than a sec. Can you maybe turn off your video? Maybe then it works better. Can you try to speak now?
Okay. Do you hear me? Yeah. Do you hear me now?
It works better now. I think it works better. But I think we lost about a minute of what you were saying.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, to sum up, if it's a college, don't care about it. It's the same thing as, you get into Harvard and then it's like, it doesn't really matter at which residential hall you're going to be. It's kind of the same thing. If you get rejected, as was previously said, there's going to be new opportunities. So in order for you to get the most out of them, it makes sense to get over the rejection as quickly as possible. And I think there might be kind of also peer help from other mentees as well who might not get in. So I would really recommend to reach out and kind of see whether you could discuss it with someone and not be alone with it.
I can take the last question on law. So absolutely not. It is not necessary for you to know the different types of law in detail. Actually, you're not expected to know any technical legal knowledge at all. And oftentimes you are encouraged that you shouldn't unnecessarily do that. So the reason why some colleges encourage you not to overly worry yourself about technical legal knowledge is because sometimes you will try to forcefully apply things you have read, even though you may not necessarily understand them. And the reality is that whoever's interviewing you as a law tutor will definitely know more than you do about the law. And if you say something wrong, they will point it out to you. So for law, it's really about engaging with the question, because they always they like to ask questions where there's no right or wrong answer. So it's all about understanding and seeing how you reason through problems, how you identify assumptions, how you establish and distinguish nuances. So perhaps just to give a little bit more context on law interviews, if there's anyone else on this call applying for law, generally there are 3 types of law interviews. Firstly, personal statement interviews. So those are very straightforward. You get asked in a personal statement. Secondly, case or reading material interviews. Usually you'll be given either a case or perhaps a document that contains a statute or several statutes. And then based on this pre-reading, they will discuss the case or the statute with you. So for those cases, for those interviews, you need to be able to know how to read a case. So that can be a very useful thing to prepare. Know how to identify the ratio decidendi, know how to essentially try to understand what's going on in the case. And the third one is the hypotheticals. So the 2 interview examples which I provided from my own, those were instances of hypotheticals. So you can't really prepare for those because they are like completely out of thin air. So for those, it's really important for you to be able to form opinions on things. Because for instance, in my interview, I had to do with to what extent should somebody who of no action of their own, for instance, be morally obliged to return money. So for example, if somebody accidentally sent $10,000 to my bank account, I didn't do anything. Should I be morally obliged to return the money? So think about these kind of moral dilemmas. Basic reading on philosophical concepts like utilitarianism, libertarianism can be useful, but again, not absolutely necessary. So it's more important that you form opinions, and more important that you are able to reason your opinions. Yeah, so that's for the law question specifically.
Okay, thank you very much. So unless there are any more questions, I think we can complete the session. I didn't see any further questions. Did you see any further questions anywhere? No. Good. So thank you very much to the speakers. Thank you so much for taking the time, and hope to see you again soon around Project Access. And thank you to everyone who listened today, to the attendees, and I hope this has been useful. If you have any more questions, don't hesitate to send us messages on the Facebook chat, either to Project Access Austria or to Project Access International. If you're a Project Access Austria post bootcamp program participant, then feel free to send me an email directly, and I'm happy to share any resources that were mentioned by email there as well. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for attending, and goodbye.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you. Hope I helped.
Thank you so